Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, and with the relatively recent lore development which culminated in the, spoiler alert, death of the remaining elven gods, I thought it would be an interesting exercise to go through the history and motivations of the other major outlawed religious sect among the Iosans, otherwise known as the Seekers. Pertinently, the narrative framing device for this entire channel has come to be formed around an elf who identifies as a Seeker, so getting a bit more of a personally nuanced take on recent in-world events and the future of the Seekers' very existence may prove to be an interesting exercise. When Syra returned to Ios, though the event itself received a muted reaction, its long-term consequences were far-reaching in dictating the direction the Iosans would eventually take throughout what we elves euphemistically call the Last Decline, and in our histories name the reign of the Sairs. In this time, the Halatir, though aware there was a problem, understatement this may be, afflicting the elven race and our goddess, did little to seek an answer, whether publicly or privately. As even many humans know, the early members of the Retribution sought their answers through death and destruction, pointing at their work in apprehending or assassinating human arcanists when Cyrus seemed to show signs of recovery, believing active human use of magic weakened her. This was true, but to so small an extent as to be meaningless to act upon. Concerning the Seekers, however, humanity would come to understand what it was we did, but only a little of why, or rather, why we believed our approach might work. The first Seeker among Iosans was the Master Diviner Virilis Irias, who, despite his advancing years, was the one to identify the Nis as key to answering many questions. He imparted upon his followers a belief in ancient prophecies concerning the nature of the gods and their preservation, based on lore which dates back to long before the Cataclysm. This law, suspiciously, was declared forbidden by the Fane of Syra, but that it existed and was interpreted as key to the restoration of the Divine Court drove the Seekers as an organisation to find more which would confirm this belief and guide us to that goal. But although the Retribution and the Seekers did make the effort which our high nobility declined to display, doing so went against the conservative priesthood. Matters would not improve. To the extent more radical among the priests would side with the mage hunters of the Retribution, forcing the hand of the leadership and the consulate court. Neither the Retribution nor the Seekers would be welcome among those people who supposedly mattered to the Iosan nation. At first, the Seekers explored the length of Ios and read every word in every book in every library where they could gain access. Even Irias himself was known to steal from the Fane of Cyrus' sacred library in search for clues. No, few attempted to gain entry to the archives of Nero, lawkeeper of the Divine Court, though what was not destroyed by the Eldritch of Eversail came to be jealously guarded by them, and they would allow no eyes of the living curious upon them. Those who made their way towards that desecrated fane became fewer and fewer with each passing generation, for elders among the Seekers came to theorize that what the Eldritch possessed was of little use to anyone but themselves, and for all their power, they remained hidden away for hundreds of years, only to arise when Ios' situation was at its direst, with little to show for their long slumber. Many reasons that had the Eldritch known of the means to revive the Divine Court, they would have conferred the power upon themselves and sought to rule Ios and conquer with their newfound strength. Yet this never came about, nor did the actions of the Eldritch of Eversail upon allying themselves with the risen Eldritch of Gearshield and Alara suggest they possessed any advantage to exert authority beyond their centuries-long experience as these undead creatures. Concerning Gearshield, in the time when he was called Gorshade, his defeat and flight from Ios led to a legitimization of sorts for the Seekers, and to distance themselves from his actions, many from Eris and the families of House Vire openly aided our sect, or even called themselves Seekers, particularly a number of scholars from among the Nimin of House Vire. Elsewhere, Seekers studied any historic elven presence across the continent. Even though relations between elves and other races had been better in past generations, especially with the dwarves, such information was scarce. And what little there was only reinforced our belief answers were not to be found in the deaths of human arcanists. What those answers were, exactly, remained elusive, though. Into the last Hessian of the Last Decline, Seekers worked feverishly to find and obtain any scrap of lore we could, but as a reflection of the mounting desperation which affected the Retribution's mage hunters, among many Seekers, the prophecies which contributed to the sect's founding beliefs seemingly ran the course of their usefulness, for they provided answers only to confirm what things were not. Thus, they were quickly left by the wayside in favour of searching for that which might offer hope and a potential course of action for the long-term future. Most of us already knew the chances of finding solutions in the West were slim, simply from studying our own ancient history. And though many ventured into the Bloodstone in search of ancient Iosan ruins, they were simultaneously the most desperate, the most pragmatic, the bravest, and thus the most doomed. I myself thought to seek guidance from the people of Bemoth, believing their friendship with the Iosans in millennia past might provide at least some answers, perhaps new and better questions. Naturally, this was much to the chagrin of my peers who considered such a voyage foolish and hopeless at best, to suicidal at worst. And they were right, for the Sun-Eater Mountains are not a welcoming place, and I returned from there without ever laying eyes on Bemoth, learning precious little, and witnessing the deaths of companions before even arriving before the Grinding Teeth mountain range. Despite my ambitions for this voyage, my own hubris, shall we say, blinded me to what was realistic a task for just a small group of individuals. Along my path or close to it were a multitude of ancient Iosan ruins, which I believed to be sources of much-needed lore, especially at Lackeys, though how perilous searching those places was a question answerable only in hindsight. After but one failure, and perhaps unnecessarily loss, only an equally dangerous return awaited me. And yet, I was not the first to venture into what was once the Empire of Laos, and I was not the first to return empty-handed, though few returned at all. This is not to say we were without purpose in the West. Some Hessians after the return of Syra, or, more pertinently, after the refusal of the Nis embassy, but not long after the declaration of outlawing the Seeker order, many believed answers might be sought with the descendants of Eric and his followers, and the priesthood of that people. It was only with the benefit of hindsight that it was feared contact had been irrevocably lost. For almost the span of an entire elven generation, the youth of Ios did not even know whether or not the Nis still remained. The Seekers, though, would be the ones to guide the elves on the path to reconciliation and reunification. Finding them was the first obstacle, and though this was the easy step, for rumours of Nis skirmishes with the peoples of the north were straightforward enough to follow, the difficult part was convincing the now much changed exiled children of Nisathil their erstwhile countryfolk wished to speak with them. As the slighted party, the Nis remembered the fate of their embassy to Ios for far longer than those of Sheer did, and initial attempts to seek counsel with Nis priests and elders were coldly rebuffed. They would not turn us away with violence out of respect that our forebears were once neighbours, but for those of us who were insistent and naive in believing old grievances could be so easily forgiven or forgotten, violence was just as easily threatened. Theirs was a justified response, but it was not reciprocated when Everblight emerged. For if there is anything of benefit which that dragon did, it drove the Nis and Iosans into cooperation with each other again, at a time when friendship seemed far from the minds of either. Nevertheless, this led to the last notable achievement of both the Seekers and Mage Hunters before the reintegration of the Nis into the Elven nation, the recovery of Nisor, and reuniting him with his sister, Syra. The mounting hostilities in the west, coupled with the Scorn invasion, limited the Seekers' activity, though efforts were concentrated on locating the mantle of Lasir. Based on speaking with Kyr Aransors of the Nis, we knew Nisor had returned to Imoran with it, but it was no longer with him, and he was currently too weakened to even convey anything to his priests, only to Syra. Notable Seekers of the current generation who are as well known among the other peoples of Western Imoran as among their fellow elves include Silas Wishnele, who would often work alongside counterparts among the retribution of Syra, out of expedience. He was not always so pragmatic, for like all Seekers during their youth, he held himself apart from the politics of Ios at large, and disdained the goals and means of the retribution, looking to develop the skills necessary to barter his way to obtaining lore and knowledge from those who would otherwise deny it to him. What it cost him, however, was his idealism, for his arcane strength was what many mercenary commanders sought, and Silas became a first-hand witness to many of the wars which tore through Western Imoran. Knowing this was almost certain to befall Ios whether or not Elvenkind were to be saved, he agreed to pass his findings to retribution agents, eventually collaborating with them as much as openly. On the other hand, Iana abandoned the name of her Halatir or Falatir, I know not which she was born into, long before taking her exile from Ios. Despite having similar experiences as Silas, she would remain loyal to her principles, and though retribution agents sought her out, she rebuffed them each time, refusing to be party to any wholesale action against the Arcanists of mankind. Such was her stance regarding a desire to find another solution. Unlike many other Seekers who travel with fellow elves, be it former retribution zealots or other willing exiles, Iana's companion is human, which in itself caused resentment, particularly with the more hawkish among mage hunters. Given the extent of her separation from the land of her birth, and the increasing reality that the forces of the retribution are as much as the army of Ios, some believe Iana has forsaken her heritage almost entirely, her fellow Seekers with regret, and the mage hunters with no little bitterness. It is not difficult to understand why this might be, for among the growing influence of the retribution, the elven hinterlands became where the Seekers often had a cold welcome at best, thanks in no small part to our amicable relationships among the many Imrese peoples, and willingness to spend months away from our homes in far-off lands. And one who came to be neither a devout disciple of Irias nor one who compromised for the retribution was the hermit of Henchhold, who was old enough to have forgotten almost everything about his very self, even up to and including his name of birth. He was young and hopeful once, though it seems at some point in time he changed into a reflection of elven kind, quietly accepting of what he feels is inevitable. When he took residence at the Henge, he came to learn more than any other seeker who had come either before or after. What he learned would not be known for many years before he emerged from his hermitage, and what he related to the leaders of Ios and Retribution was not especially welcome knowledge. Most of it was not so much prophecy as foresight of the events which would befall Imoran, but more relevantly for the elves and the seekers, our gods. Compelled to see and pass on his visions by the infernals of the Nanocrian order, perhaps as a mortal herald whose age and nature as an elf, living in the lands of mankind, would give his words severity and gravity which could not be denied by those who heard them, be they human, elven, or trollkin. How the hermit came by these visions he does not know, or perhaps does not wish to know or remember. In the years after the claiming, with his duty to the infernals forcibly completed by their defeat, but without any reprieve from his gift and curse of foresight, he has been unable to escape his identity as the infernal afflicted elf of Henchhold, taking him where his visions force him to journey. His future is his and his alone, irrevocably severed from any past he may have lived as a seeker or as an elf. But what of the here and now? With the deaths of Sara and Nisor, the retribution is no longer with a cause to call their own, while we, the seekers, no longer know what it is we seek. Or rather, how far our goal lies distant has only grown exponentially, to the extent many would justifiably consider it impossible within our lifetimes. The prophecies of Irias' studies did not speak of such tragedy which overtook us, and we are without guidance, for they spoke of neither Grimkin nor Infernal walking upon Cain during this generation. After the rivening of the priests of Sara and Nisor, we realized we lost our purpose. Some grew insane with grief, whether at the fact of the gods passing or having their vocation rendered meaningless. Others grew insane through the desire to remain optimistic despite what had happened. And for the rest of us, the welfare of our fellow Iosans in this was our first thought. So for the last 5 years we've done what we can to hold the elven race together, alongside what leaders remain. With some sense of stability regained, there remained that matter of what we would do next. Thus do all of us, whether by ourselves or with our peers as we so choose, decide what best to do, scattered across the land as we are, cut off from both each other and our homelands. Those who maintain the Seeker's original goal of finding information which might restore the Divine Court, except now in its entirety, are few, perhaps the fewest of those who act with such a particular goal in mind. Many wish merely to find a way to preserve elven souls, now there is nothing to prevent their loss in the wilds beyond the veld. And there are those who believe there is yet knowledge which may be found within the borders of Ios, whether it is from the Eldritch or from the Forbidden Temple close to Erith Eluer. Long barred from entry, there is a group who believes some answers are within that ancient place's walls, particularly the secret lore of Osiris, Intisar of ours. With the passing of the gods, it is unknown whether the wards protecting the Forbidden Temple have weakened or not. More generally concerning Ios, no few have joined a successor sect of the Retribution, whose goal, at least for now, is simply to find out all that has happened within our homelands. I have cooperated with them on occasion, and like them, found out a little about life and undeath in Ios. But since I am yet to set foot within any of Ios's once great cities again, there is much any of us may yet learn. And with the elven people scattered across the lands surrounding Ios, alternative questions are being asked which may have their answers in little explored places, such as the eerie lost forest of Uralize. But for myself, here you find me, a travelling chronicler, though I gladly accept what knowledge is offered.